Hi, and welcome to another episode of Reading the Fundamentals. Reading is lit with me, Professor Stephanie Johnson, also known as the Write, W-R-I-T-E Professor. So here we are in episode 7, and I've entitled this episode The Literariness of Charlottesville. Charlottesville, referring to Charlottesville, Virginia. As you may or may not know, recently in Charlottesville, Virginia, there were protests, riots, and fighting that broke out in regards to the memorializing of historical monuments and the removing of those monuments that were dedicated to factors and factions in our country that perpetuated and promoted the enslavement of other human beings here in our country. In reports, many of the young men seen protesting for or marching for or speaking out for the preservation of these particular monuments and memorials were and are known as white nationalists, white supremacists. What this means is that these people, these men and some women, they are for the perpetuation of an ideology of what can be known as whiteness and what is known in literature as whiteness, that is based in a white identity of the American. Not only that, this notion of the American, the true American, as white is of course to the detriment and to the denigration of races and cultures that do not identify as white. And this of course is based in a historical supremacy idea of white being superior. Dr. Morrison's argument in Playing in the Dark, Whiteness in the Literary Imagination, is multi-layered, but the foundational premise is this: that the American white identity is written about and constructed in early American literature. That identity is often built and discovered in opposition to and in superiority to a looming darkness that exists. She basically says that this darkness is the Africanist presence, that this whiteness has to encounter in order to come into its own, in order to realize its full identity. There seems to be a more or less tacit agreement among literary scholars that because American literature has been clearly the preserve of white male views, genius, and power, those views, genius, and power are without relationship to and removed from the overwhelming presence of Black people in the United States. This agreement is made about a population that preceded every American writer of renown and was, I have come to believe, one of the most furtively radical impinging forces on the country's literature. The contemplation of this Black presence is central to any understanding of our national literature and should not be permitted to hover at the margins of the literary imagination. So what she's basically saying in that particular passage is that even in American literature, you can see that the agency of creativity and imagination of early American literature was the genius of, thought to be the genius of, white American males with no other influence than their genius, their imagination, their creativity, and power. Not so. Of course, we know that not only was there an Africanist presence during that time, but the presence of women. So not only do we see that superiority and that oppression of others in the writing of early American literature, but also in the literary critique of early American literature. And again, the shouts of the white supremacy and white nationalist rants in Charlottesville were shouts for the preservation of that identity that was built on the oppression of others. Dr. Morrison writes, through significant and underscored omissions, startling contradictions, heavily nuanced conflicts, through the way writers peopled their work with the signs and bodies of this presence, one can see that a real or fabricated Africanist presence was crucial to their sense of Americanness. and it shows. Dr. Morrison continues, the scholarship that looks into the mind, imagination, and behavior of slaves is valuable, but equally valuable is a serious intellectual effort to see what racial ideology does to the mind, imagination, and behavior of masters. I would definitely pause here to say that Charlottesville is a prime example of the effects and the impact racial ideology has on those who perpetuate it. They want to continue to perpetuate it at all costs. So here's an example from Edgar Allan Poe's The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, How Whiteness Constructed Itself in Opposition to a Looming Darkness to Realize Its Identity. Here we go. March 22nd. The darkness had materially increased, relieved only by the glare of the water thrown back from the white curtain before us. Many gigantic and pallidly white birds flew continuously now from beyond the veil, and their scream was the eternal "Takikili" as they retreated from our vision. Hereupon Nunu stirred in the bottom of the boat, but upon touching him, we found his spirit departed. And now we rushed into the embraces of the cataract, where a chasm threw itself open to receive us. But there arose in our pathway a shrouded human figure, very far larger in its proportions than any dweller among men. And the hue of the skin of the figure was of the perfect whiteness of the snow. Morrison interprets, the images of impenetrable whiteness need contextualizing to explain their extraordinary power, pattern, and consistency, because they appear almost always in conjunction with representations of Black or Africanist people who are dead, impotent, or under complete control. These images of blinding whiteness seem to function as both antidote for and meditation on the shadow that is companion to this whiteness, a dark and abiding presence that moves the hearts and texts of American literature with fear and longing. This haunting, a darkness from which our early literature seemed unable to extricate itself, suggests the complex and contradictory situation in which American writers found themselves during the formative years of the nation's literature. And I'll say it again, Charlottesville is an eruption of the preservation of that identity. To remove the monuments and the markers is to erase the identity, white American male identity, that was established in early America and constructed in early American literature. Morrison continues. Black slavery enriched the country's creative possibilities. For in that construction of Blackness and enslavement could be found not only the not free, but also, with the dramatic polarity created by skin color, the projection of the not me. The result was a playground for the imagination. What rose up out of collective needs to allay internal fears and to rationalize external exploitation was an American Africanism, a fabricated brew of darkness, otherness, alarm, and desire that is uniquely American. There also exists, of course, a European Africanism with a counterpart in colonial literature. But it gets even better. Morrison continues. Bernard Bailyn has provided us with an extraordinary investigation of European settlers in the act of becoming Americans. I take this to be a succinct portrait of the process by which the American as new, white, and male was constituted. A sense of authority and autonomy he had, not known before, a force that flowed from his absolute control over the lives of others. He emerged a distinctive new man, a borderland gentleman, a man of property in a raw, half-savage world. A power, a sense of freedom he had not known before. But what had he known before? Fine education, London sophistication, theological and scientific thought. None of these, one gathers, could provide him with the authority and autonomy that Mississippi planter life did. So out of all of his accomplishments, the only thing that made him a white American male was the subjugation of another human being. Yes, I'm still talking about whiteness and the literary imagination, and I'm still talking about Charlottesville, the literariness of Charlottesville. So to quickly and succinctly bring this all together, the identity of whiteness in literature and in American culture was constructed in opposition to another being. At that time, blackness, Africanness, darkness, a looming dark presence that existed not only in American society and culture, but that was constructed into and written into American literature because it existed contextually when the works were written. This white identity, this whiteness was again created and found its being, its existence, its meaning in opposition to that other. Charlottesville was a representation of the preservation of that identity that was built in opposition to other. So of course, what was built in opposition to other can only be perpetuated in opposition to other. And that's why Charlottesville erupted. Understanding how racial ideology, racist ideology, and racism impact the minds and imagination and expression of not only the oppressed, but the oppressor helps us to further deconstruct how racism has impacted our entire existence in the United States of America. In doing so, we are able to find different ways of attempting to heal old wounds so events like Charlottesville won't continue to happen. By doing so, we begin to, per se, pull down the monuments of the mind that have raised themselves up against it in opposition to the true vision of what an American is in this country, the true vision of what America should be, the land of the free, the home of the brave, that whole vision that was perpetuated and written about in the Constitution itself. We're not seeing it. We're still striving towards it. And again, understanding how racial ideology, racist ideology, and racism impact the mind and imagination help us to heal these wounds. Playing in the Dark, Whiteness and the Literary Imagination, written by Dr. Toni Morrison and published in 1992, is a foundational text because of one main reason. It was used as a foundational text to spark what is now known as whiteness studies. Whiteness studies is a discourse in our higher educational conversation that talks about how the white identity was constructed historically, how it was identified and defined historically, how it's interpreted through different aspects and facets of education and culture, and how it's perpetuated. So that's how this text is foundational to our culture, literary culture, educational culture, social culture. It provides lots of insights. This has been episode 7 of Reading the Fundamentals. Reading is Lit with me, ProfSdenise Johnson, also known as The Write, WRITE Professor. It's always a pleasure sharing with you. And remember, reading is lit.